Hello, I'm Nicholas Barrett.
And I'm Maria Demertzis.
And you're listening to Sound of Economics. Now, thanks to digital technology, finance has become instant and global in ways that would have been difficult to imagine just a few decades ago. Meanwhile, our day-to-day lives are becoming cashless, while the Internet of Things has integrated our tangible assets with our intangible clouds and codes. But has our desire for speed and convenience made us vulnerable? Can we protect our critical online infrastructure from those who may seek to undermine our society? Jukka Savolainen is Director of Community of Interest, Vulnerabilities and Resilience at the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. Jukka, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So, for listeners who might not know, what is a hybrid attack?
Well, hybrid attack would be a significant part of a hybrid conflict where a hybrid adversary is trying to undermine our systems. And in case of an attack, they would really do something to disrupt something.
So what's the difference between a regular attack and what we would call a hybrid attack?
Well, yes, all this hybridity is meant to be something that is under the threshold of real acts of war. So this is something minor, and the important part is that things may tend to happen beyond the level of detection, so we wouldn't even realize that something is happening. And if we see that something happens, then they tend to remain below a threshold of attribution, meaning we cannot say, hey, you did this, or at least we cannot say it credibly enough. And even in those cases, then it's possible that we can detect and attribute some things, but it would remain anyway under the threshold of war, meaning under the threshold of military response.
So, Maria, you've been working on this as well. Perhaps you could describe a hypothetical hybrid attack and how we might first become aware of it even happening.
Indeed. And what you guys said about it's below the threshold of detection, which is we don't know who's doing this. Somebody is doing it, is affecting the society. And it can take very simple forms. You could think about a smear campaign starting out, let's say, in one of the social media, let's say for a particular bank. This is actually something that has happened. So for false news, fake news were distributed about a particular bank in Bulgaria. And that led to effectively a run on that bank, which is something extremely important for the bank itself, for the financial system of the country, and of course for the individuals. You could think of other things as well. You could think of a cyber attack, so meaning it comes through the internet, that puts down electricity systems. That's also happened, that we have observed things like that. So it's difficult to attribute. We don't know who has done it, and it's difficult to justify a military counterattack. And yet again, it is an attack for all sorts of purpose.
Because one of the things a hostile actor could do, for instance, is they could initiate a cyber attack against our financial infrastructure and then at the same time initiate a social media campaign directing the blame towards another actor to kind of polarize and confuse society. That's something you've been working on, isn't it?
Really so. And this was a good example of how with a divisive messaging, you could keep the target confused.
So why is this an issue now in 2020? Why are we talking about this more?
Well, frankly speaking, I think after the attack of or occupation of Crimea by the Russians, it was done in such a clever way and using very many instruments in and against Ukraine and Crimea. And then it suddenly happened and nobody could do anything. And that was started to be called then hybrid threats and hybrid warfare.
And I think actually that the digital component of it is crucial here. There's nothing specific about 2020 that is important in this discussion. What's important in my view is what you said also in your introduction, that the future is digital. And therefore all our services, from electricity to payments to the way that we pay taxes, all of this happens through a system that is not entirely controllable. And this is what makes us vulnerable.
So today at Bruegel, we've been having a day-long workshop talking about hybrid attacks, how they might happen, and what kind of damage they could do to the financial system to electricity grid, perhaps transport networks and so on, all the kind of daily things we take for granted. Now, I was sitting in on some of it, and it seemed like it was very heavy on descriptions of the danger, but kind of light on solutions and how we can actually protect ourselves against these things.
It depends, of course, what sector you're talking about. Here at Bruegel, we have looked a little bit closer on the financial system and how well the financial system itself is more better prepared for something like this. And indeed, it falls exactly in the way you described it. We understand the risks and we try to prepare for the sort of detect them and then prepare for them. We are less good in understanding how some of these risks and dangers will proliferate if they were to happen, and who should manage this? And it's it's particularly relevant in the EU, where we still have sovereign states, and these types of issues, which are ultimately security issues, they still remain at the national level, and yet our ambitions in our organization on the economics level is done transnationally, at least at the EU level. And that creates a real and important vulnerability for the EU financial system.
So, Jukka, I suppose we learned about this the hard way after the occupation of Crimea and certain parts of Ukraine. And it made us ask ourselves questions about whose responsibility this is and how we should react. And I suppose the dilemma is that Europe has obviously become a lot more integrated over the last few decades. It's obviously one big single market, and we're trying to create a single market for services as well as goods. So we're getting closer together every day, really. But national security is typically considered a nation-state issue. But at the same time, obviously, we're becoming more integrated. So what have we learned about whose responsibility this is?
Well, this is very important to recognize that the money and the resources to do the thing are on the private side, and they are in the banks, so to say. And then the responsibility can be a little bit debated because, of course, if it's an external threat, it will come from out of the box of the normal risk analysis and risk analysis that the banks, for example, are doing, because they are just facing normal criminals, etc. And now if there is a state actor behind who has really well planned and organized something, it will be bigger than the normal business can be prepared to. And that's why it is for the public sector. And as you say rightly, the finance sector is already integrating very much. I would say the only good way to do is to do it on community level. So let's say EU level should be active here. It's also concerning the problem if we start doing regulations that are trying to improve our resilience. If we do regulation country by country, it will be really bad for business and harass the competition. So that's also why it should be done in as big entities as possible. I would also like to say that having heard the discussions today, that now the money should talk.
Indeed.
Because they have now obviously so much information and understanding on the topics and ongoing problems already, that I think if they start somehow, we could even help them by us with Bruegel to stimulate how they get organized in exchanging this information and threat scenarios and the potential preparations. I think the state authorities then would listen carefully.
If I may add to that, I think the exchange of information is a very good starting point. But what we observe right now, it is when there is an attack of that sort, let's say to a financial institution, a bank, this information, of course, moves up to the responsible authorities at the national level, let's say the national security authorities. It also moves, let's say, since we are talking about banks here, it moves to the ECB, who is the regulator, but then nothing else moves either back or in parallel. And this is what I think is the problem here. You can have, let's say, a national bank, a bank that operates in one country, but it has branches elsewhere, and it will affect other countries. But this parallel dissemination of information doesn't happen as fast as perhaps it ought to happen.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, actually. Can we currently rely on banks and the private sector to protect themselves against this kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I think that when you asked about responsibility, and I think incentives here are important. Banks, of course, have incentives to protect themselves. So they have incentives to put, processes in place that are going to detect risks, and they're going to ensure that there is operational continuity if and when they are attacked. But what they don't have incentives to look after is what it means for the rest of the financial sector, unless it's directly relevant to them. And this is where the public good nature of the problem arises. This is why it needs to go beyond the individual banks. And in fact, there was a very interesting study that came out a couple of years ago when they asked institutions how well they were prepared, and they would say, oh, they were very well prepared. They just didn't think others were prepared. I think what that means is effectively that they don't. What the individual institutions don't have in place is the systemicness of this issue. So it's not that others are not prepared. Everyone is singly, individually prepared, but the system as a whole may not be well prepared to handle for this. And this is where, I agree with Jukka, this is, we need the national authorities and preferably the EU authorities to look after something like that.
Jukka, what is the plan now if the financial services, if the financial infrastructure we have goes down? Is there a plan at the moment? Is there a contingency plan? If ATMs stopped working in the next hour, is there a plan?
Well, and this again, then this goes down to be a national issue, and ideally it would be very nice if there were cash to be dispensed somehow.
So it's every member state for itself.
Yeah, sure.
Well, in fact, both are true in the sense that if a bank in a country is attacked, there will be information that goes into the national security authorities and it will go to the ECB. But the action that needs to be taken in order to ensure continuity is in fact a national action, and it's not entirely ideally coordinated.
If this is the new kind of way that perhaps hostile countries are going to interact with each other, should the European Union prepare some kind of mechanism for retaliation? Should we be ready to launch our own kind of hybrid attacks?
If countries attack or if individuals attack, because this is it's not just about rogue nations that attack, it could be also individuals, and I think in some ways these are more active. The element of attribution that we started with, Jukka said, is easier if it goes back to a country than if it goes to an individual, because it's easier to identify. The ambition to counterattack is of course something that is not in the thinking of the EU. The EU is not there. It doesn't have the ambitions to be a military power. The question is, do we need a minimum? And it depends how big this minimum is, level of preparedness at the military side in order to be able to have a credible counterattack to protect ourselves. This is the issue here. It's not that we want to become a military power in the global scene, but we need to be prepared to have that military clout, if I may say, that is going to protect us.
Is this a job for NATO or PESCO?
Oh, well, hard to compare these two, a little bit different ideas. NATO is doing the military response in case of a clear military offense, and that's it. But this kind of now the discussion about counterattacking after financial something is more complicated, and I think because we have a strong, of course, and we need to have rightly strong tradition of legality in European Union. Now these counter strikes in economic of cyber field, they are difficult to arrange because finally, unless it has been legislated how this can be done, if it's not legislated, you will finally find a person responsible for the damage on the other side. And so long discussion.
Organizations like NATO, too archaic to deal with this. Obviously, they were established for the Cold War basically 70 years ago for threats that are no longer considered particularly prevalent. And now that we're in the 21st century with threats that our grandparents couldn't even imagine, do we need new institutions and new organizations to deal with these?
Well, Jukka, you have a military background. Maybe you're better to answer this. But I certainly agree with the fact that the threats are different now. You cannot think of these issues in the same ways that we thought about it in the 40s and the 50s. I think what's different now is the level of interdependence. So how can a small interference, even in the financial sector, we could think about an attack on a very small bank in some remote place in Europe that can proliferate. This is what I think is different, because it's very unexpected. The effects and the way that they proliferate in the system will be unexpected. And that, of course, requires a new level of thinking and, indeed, a new level of preparedness.
I think where the establishing organizations is a big job and you never know what you get. So the old organizations are good to me and they must be kept agile. But here I would again emphasize the role of the private sector as itself, because they should feel interested in defending them and creating a better resilience against this and that kind of predictable disturbances. And so we might really start about supporting the private sector's cooperation in this field, exchanging of information and sharing the understanding of this bigger threat that certainly comes from outside of the normal box of their thinking of security.
And if I may add to that, I think that I agree entirely with this idea that the private sector needs to play an active role here. And perhaps taking that even one step further, I would really like to find ways of encouraging the creation of insurance markets. I think this is a very good point of quantifying risks and preparing for them, because then you have everybody studying the risk from all sides.
Insurance, I really love this word in this context, because whether it's shipping or whatever critical infrastructure, it is in very many cases possible that the hybrid operation is waged against one or two smaller elements at the time. And then we could see especially organs like EU having stored money in and following some sort of insurance thinking. And that would then be used to support these elements of our society that are shaking because of a hybrid operation.
Yeah, we can ask the markets then to price that risk for us, which is a good way of doing that.
Maria, politically speaking, if a European country did become victim to a successful hybrid attack, do you think that an example could serve as an argument against ever closer union and a more integrated economy and a more integrated digital infrastructure in a country? People could say, well, actually, it's too dangerous to have all this integration and interconnection. We need to separate our institutions and we need to separate the digital infrastructure that basically moves the modern world.
I would say it's exactly the opposite. It is difficult to make this point, because what our ambition is to integrate. Our ambition economically, the welfare of the societies, they get better as we do more together. Yes, indeed, it does increase our interconnectedness, increases the risk of one affecting all. But if our ambitions should not be defined by our threats, our ambitions should be defined by welfare implications. So I think it's exactly the opposite. If a country became the victim of counterattack, it would be more of a case for strengthening the way we monitor and prepare for such situations.
I think that's a very interesting point, but I was just thinking about digital media, and we were told maybe 10 or 15 years ago that the internet would bring us all together, socially at least. But what we saw perhaps a few years ago was bad faith actors from autocratic states infiltrating, well, not infiltrating, but very legitimately joining our digital platforms and basically poisoning the public sphere with disinformation.
Yeah, emphasis on the word, indeed, emphasis on the word poison. You could die with aspirin as well if you over-abuse it. So that's not the argument. What we need...
And those autocratic states themselves do not have any interest in exposing themselves to such influence from us. So Russia, for instance, has its own Facebook. China is behind a great digital wall. They don't want anything to do with one online ecosystem, because it's too dangerous, because it's too easy for other people to poison the well, as it were. So for them, maybe they have a more stable public sphere. Of course, that's a matter for debate. But the fact that these things can be done seems to have served as an argument against connection.
Yeah, but that's against the philosophy of the Western world, which is a philosophy of openness, of interconnectedness, and of in the case of the EU, close relationships. So no, I don't. Yes, the risks increase. We need to acknowledge that, and that's why we have a discussion today, the event today. Yeah. And we'll continue to talk about these things. But it's not. Progress is one way. It's a unidirectional. You can't go back on progress on technology.
You can't. But I guess I was worried that people might come to believe that the belief in connection as a public good, as an unambiguous public good, could fall away in light of threats like this.
Yeah, no, interconnectedness is good, but in moderation and with a pure understanding of what the risks it entails.
I think there is a serious challenge, which is well motivated. Some think that we allowed too much freedom and liberalism, and thus the societies became uncontrollable. and that it is possible from the other side to exercise more control and to have a more stable growth without so many freedoms, of course. It's a big principal issue, and I, of course, support Maria that our way is that of freedom and free thinking and free talking.
Well, we need to get you back upstairs for the event, but thank you very much for joining us. And thank you very much, Maria, for coming as well. If you want to read more about hybrid attacks, there is a paper on Google.org by Guntram Wolf and yourself.
Indeed.
Yes, which outlays these threats, and as you see, they can play into a much bigger picture about the future of liberal democracy and liberal capitalism, I suppose. So yes, thank you very much for listening, and if you're interested, there is more to be read.